So I'm going to talk to you about something that I have been thinking about a great deal for basically all of my sentient life. It's not something that I've done a lot of personal work on, but I hope to. And so I'm going to have more questions in this talk than I do answers. But hopefully I'll give you some things to think about. And here we go. This is a lady who is part of the Financial Inclusion Project in Himachal Pradesh in India. This is the first time she's ever been to a bank. Notice that she's getting cash, but she is dealing with the bank, and that's what financial inclusion is about. It's offering services similar to the services that we all enjoy to people who are currently unbanked or underbanked. And you might ask why people need banks. Well, think about it. You don't carry much cash around, probably. My kid, who's 28, never carries cash. He does everything with a card, and that's because it's secure. He doesn't have to worry about losing it. And he used to lose money all the time before he got his first ATM card. So imagine what this could do to somebody's life. First, I want to tell you where I come from. I come from open source. Clap if you know what that means. You have no idea what that means to me, because I just spent the last 16 years making sure that you all knew what it was. Open source was a lift for everybody that got involved with it. It's a gift economy. It's about creating more value than you try to monetize. In some cases, not trying to monetize at all, although it's not really a bad thing to make money in open source. And that's part of what makes the wheel go around. But this helps you understand, the kinds of changes that I like to see in the world. I grew up in the 1960s in Los Angeles. And what that means is I lived in a time when media was really bombarding us for the first time. So TV in the 50s was this little tiny box that you could kind of ignore if you wanted to. But in the 60s, they got bigger, they got color, and stuff started coming into our consciousness that really changed the way that we grew up and the way that we thought. So for instance, I saw a lot of big kids, bigger than me, that were having a lot of fun. And I wanted to be one of those kids really badly. But also, I saw graphic images of people who were desperately poor in a way that had not commonly been seen in the US before, aside from our own depression. There was, a certain amount of photography that happened in our own depression. But we didn't see a whole lot of this before the 1960s. And it was an unprecedented time of financial ease for most Americans. For the first time post-World War II, people kind of had enough. But then we saw things like this. We also saw this. This is the Vietnam War. It came into our homes every single night, almost like a sitcom. And it was live feed. So these days, when you see the war on TV, it's a few days later, a few hours later, and there's been editing. But at this time, the conjunction of the ability to beam a signal right into your home, and a very interesting thing that was going on meant that we got essentially a live feed. And there were people in the town that I lived in who actually saw their children injured before the War Department was able to get a hold of them. So this was very scary. And then what I saw was some of those same big kids deciding they didn't want to go to that war and organizing across the whole country, sort of spontaneously, to make it stop. And once again, that made me want to change the world. It isn't just me that wanted to change the world. It's my brother and pretty much every kid that I knew in that time period. It seems like this goes in waves. So in the 80s, famously, American kids wanted to make money. But in the 60s, we wanted to change the world. So when I grew up, I went to Morocco. I was in the US Peace Corps, which means that I did 2 years of service for the country, for the US country, in a country that they designated. I did this without carrying a gun. And this is where I met these ladies. These are the mule women, and they are carrying very heavy burdens of wool. And they're not doing it because they want to. They're doing it because they have to. It's the only employment that's available to them. And that is because in Morocco at that time, the prevailing conditions were such that women had special rules. They weren't commonly able to read. They didn't get literacy. And if they were so unlucky as to be divorced, they were often left with just the bangles they were wearing as their only possessions, and this didn't last very long. So then they had to take whatever work they could get. And if they were young enough, they became prostitutes, but if they were older, they got work like mule women. But what was interesting to me, and this was really the first time in my life that I had seen poverty, is that they were paid in cash. And the reason that was interesting to me was because I was also paid in cash. And that gave me the experience of what it feels like to be precarious and have to hold on to this precious resource and be worried all the time that it's going to get lost and you're not going to be able to pay your rent or whatever. Okay, fast forward to San Francisco, the city that I moved to when I came back from Morocco, and I've lived there more than half of my life now. San Francisco is a very small place. It's mostly a wealthy place. It's in the most populous city, or most populous state in America. California has more people living in it than any other state. And a lot of those people are immigrants. And that's because America is a country of immigrants. I think this is pretty well known, that we, for a long time, basically have been, influxes of immigrants have come into America and become citizens, and this is kind of what America is. However, every successive wave causes the people who got there before to be upset. So in San Francisco, we have undocumented workers. These are workers working in kitchens, and these are the people that I've been thinking about lately, because both of my children work in this environment. And a lot of their coworkers are undocumented, and they worry about them, and they come home to me with stories about, what they live with. So they mostly walk to America. They don't get on boats, they walk because they live within the contiguous continents. And some of them walk thousands of miles. And the reason that they're doing this, and it's really dangerous, some of them die of exposure, some of them get involved in shady transport. They think they'd rather be in a car, and then it turns out to be a truck, and there's no oxygen in it, and things happen on this journey. It's dangerous. And they do it because they want a better life. These are day workers in San Francisco. You can see them on many street corners every morning. These are people who don't have skills like those restaurant workers, so they're relatively unskilled, and they'll work for as little as $5 an hour, or even $5 a day if nobody else has offered them more. And they just get in whatever car comes by and stops and says, would you pick out would you chop down this tree in my backyard? Yes, I will. So this is the better, but this is better than being home where they were, significantly better. So these guys, you mostly get paid in cash, what we call under the table. But those restaurant workers that you saw earlier, they get paid by check. And the reason they get paid by check is because the restaurants need to account for the cost of their workers. So because they're being paid by check, they also are paying taxes because they're withdrawn from their wages automatically. And they never get those taxes back because they don't have social security numbers, they don't have addresses, they don't have any of the things that they need. Notice that this check cashing kiosk picture here includes utility payments. That's because when you have only cash, you have to figure out how to pay for things that you and I pay for with a check or online or through a bank account. So again, precarious life. And then they send money home, usually right at the same time. They cash the check, and part of the money immediately gets sent home. That's a lot of why they took the trip in the first place, because they can make so much more money in the US that they can support their family at home. And a lot of them are married and have children at home that they don't see very often because it's too dangerous to go back. So, this is a lonely life. Between the fees that they pay for cashing those checks and the fees that they pay to send money home, some of them lose as much as 12% of their income to the lack of banking. And then they still have cash. They still have the risk of losing it or getting beaten up or something else happening. They fear deportation. This is a little kid that is dealing with her parents being deported, one of her parents. It's a terrifying thing because they don't know when they're going to see that person again, and their economic structure just left them. She's probably a citizen. She was probably born in the US. But now what happens? I mean, it's really very precarious. And this is why they don't want bank accounts, because they don't want to be traceable to an address so that immigration can come and take them away. So, this isn't all bad, right? Okay, so what can we do? Let's talk about money. First of all, let's acknowledge that currencies are geopolitical. That means that a currency is tied to the sovereignty of some political power. That's just how the world works now. And they have been and can be used to exert control. This is a tank, obviously, exerting control over a Volkswagen in Prague during the Prague Spring. And we've seen similar scenes more recently in the Arab Spring. But what's important to realize is these people in Prague were spending rubles at this time because they were part of the USSR. That's what being subjugated means. You lose your currency, or you gain somebody else's currency. The currency can also express local conditions. This is how many Deutschmarks it took to buy a loaf of bread in 1923 when they had hyperinflation. So a currency can really show you what's broken in an economy. And I think you guys know a lot about that right now, too. So I'd like to assert that poverty is local. If currency is geopolitical, I would like to say that poverty is local. It doesn't get a lot of airplay. Even though it's a sad story, and sometimes it's used to raise money, it's not like we get tons of news stories about poor people, at least not in America. Maybe you do here. And I would like to say also that it's a really old problem, and there have been a lot of attempts to try to fix it. But I am a great believer, through my career and what I've seen, in changing the world through technology. So I'd like to talk about some new approaches. First of all, there are cryptocurrencies. This is a Bitcoin. It's probably the most well-known cryptocurrency, but there are several others. What makes it a cryptocurrency is the underlying blockchain that is used to identify and verify transactions. It's a completely open system. Anybody can read anybody else's bank account, anybody else's transactions. You obtain anonymity by not using the same address very often, so that it can't be traced back to you. It's an interesting system and a very noble experiment. There are some problems with it, unfortunately, but I think there's some things to learn too. So first of all, for the purposes of using it, this is an app that was written for a Windows phone. It actually looks a lot like banking, or maybe like trading. And there is this idea of mining in Bitcoin, but let's leave that to the side because a lot of the modern sons of Bitcoin don't have that mining aspect because it's got some problematic bits to it. So just know that you have a balance. It's kind of like a bank balance. You can move it around. You can address it using these apps. There are exchanges that work kind of like banks. Bitcoins can be, or cryptocurrencies can be very volatile. This is Bitcoin's volatility over a year. The orange line is Bitcoin. The dotted line is the Standard & Poor's Index. So you can see that it's kind of like trading on the stock exchange to be involved with this. The really solid blue line is the euro. So that's a pretty solid currency. And in fact, in countries where the currencies are solid, it's really hard for people to conceptualize why you would want to do this cryptocurrency thing. But there are certainly places, this is Russia, the day that they put their currency on the free market, because they decided it would be too big of a drain on the country to continue to prop it up through the government means. So they put it on the free market. The same thing happened in the 70s in Mexico. So this means a lot of people suddenly don't have as much money as they thought they had, similar to that guy with the wheelbarrow in Germany. And we know what the outcome of that pressure on Germany was. This is a dangerous thing to do. So I'll bet you that Russians are thinking that cryptocurrencies might be a good thing right about now. They are unsecured. This is a former bank vault that is now a restaurant, and that's kind of how cryptocurrencies are. You get no promises, but they're based on trust, and that is a very interesting idea. The blockchain is actually the most interesting part of this whole story. And for those of you who are technologists in the room, figuring out how to make the blockchain scale so that it is practical to use it to verify identity, or putting a data layer on top of it so it creates an immutable ledger for things like land transactions. These are all experiments that are happening right now in this space. They don't look like banking. This is in Argentina, and this is a banker and his customer. In Argentina, I think it was about 18 months ago now, the government suddenly imposed a 15% tariff on credit card transactions. So if you had an online business or you needed to use credit cards, it became very expensive for businesses all of a sudden. And so a lot of them switched to Bitcoins, and with good success, at least in that one country. This is your finance minister, whose name I've been practicing over and over again, but I don't know if I'm going to get it. Anyway, he famously was spoofed on April Fool's Day, saying that he was going to just take Greece to Bitcoin if the European Union wasn't nicer to him. And actually, he's very much against that. Just let me say that for the record. He's written a very nice blog post, it's easy to find, that enumerates the reasons why it would be bad for Greece, and they happen to be the classic banking reasons why the banking world thinks that this is an interesting but flawed experiment. I will say that the company that I work for is a bank in Europe, and banks can't just decide that a currency is suddenly valid. That's something that countries do. If banks start doing that, it kind of undermines the whole banking system, and so they're hesitant to do that. However, my company does allow you to go through an exchange if you want to trade in Bitcoins. We just don't ever touch them ourselves because we're a bank. So anyway, if you want to read the whole list of reasons why not to do this, that's where I would go. But I will say that when we started open source, there were similar lists of reasons why you shouldn't do open source. So I don't know how valid that is. Here's what I do know. Technical innovation is an amazing thing. A lot of the talks that you see on this stage are about innovations that have happened in technology that are doing amazing things, opening completely new doors. I happen to know, because I was the CTO of Wikipedia, that they shift business models much more quickly than we've ever seen before. I also know that banking is 4,000 years old. And a lot of the rules that we live with in banking are more like 150 years old. The ABA system, which is the wire transfer system in America, hasn't been revised for, I think, 80 years. Online banking is about 15 years old. That's when PayPal started. We might still be nimble enough to do something different. Bitcoin is 5 years old. That means it's still going through its infancy, but there are some interesting ideas there. And what's most interesting to me is that everybody has a phone now. Everybody has a phone. So that opens possibilities that these brick and mortar companies are really not getting. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it turns out. I'm looking forward to a time when financial inclusion is actually possible. So, thank you.